Initially, I believed that I could either read Ken Follett's enormously popular novel, The Pillars of the Earth, or I could play Daedelic's video game adaptation, but I didn't think I could do both. I was sure that once I had experienced the story one way, I wouldn't want to experience it the other. Ultimately, I would choose to read the book, but to my surprise, as I did so, my interest in the game only grew, and by the time I had finished it, I was very curious to see how the game would handle its retelling. Thus, I decided to make my most niche video yet. A video exclusively for those few people who, like me, are interested to know what differs between the two formats. So, this isn't going to be a review, but I will just say a few words about the game before I start. A point-and-click adventure, it's very much in the Telltale style in that it is more an interactive movie than a puzzle game. In fact, I'm not sure there's anything really that can be classed as a puzzle in it. Fail states are rare, and getting stuck because you aren't sure what to do is pretty much impossible. It is, of course, possible to fail at key moments, but this is more likely to lead to an altered story as opposed to forcing a restart. I enjoy my Telltale-style interactive movies, but it's not for those who can't stand gameplay-like games. My favourite thing about the game is absolutely the art. Everything looks so good, particularly when it comes to the architecture, and I considered it a gift to be able to walk around in these majestic paintings, beautifully bringing to life scenes and locations from the book. Even right at the end, I still caught myself marvelling at the backdrops. Absolutely gorgeous. The animation has its own charm, though it is noticeably stiff at times, and the mouths don't always sync with what's being said. I also chose to switch subtitles on quite early after a number of occasions in which the mouths didn't move at all, which sometimes left me unsure as to who was speaking.
Philip is a good man. He was the only one to say I should have a fire.
And I think I'll leave it there for my thoughts before I get too carried away. Now, some things to understand before we get started. Firstly, this is a choice-driven game, and while I believe I am aware of all the major changes, there is always the possibility that something has slipped me by. Furthermore, my goal is to look at how the book and the game differ in telling, as close as possible, the same story. What I mean by this will become clearer later, but essentially there are a couple of changes that are sort of big, but stray too far from the book's events, so I'm not going to spend so much time covering them. Secondly, obviously, I'm not going to cover every single change made, as that would result in a very long and probably quite dry video. So I instead intend to focus generally on how the game handles key plot points and some of the more major differences. So, for example, when I say something like, apart from this, it's essentially accurate to the book, that probably still means that the scene in the book is longer, more fleshed out and with more dialogue, but ends up going mostly in the same direction. Without further ado, let's begin. The game opens with Tom Builder, his pregnant wife Agnes, and his two children, Alfred and Martha, traipsing through the snow-covered woods. Agnes starts to give birth, and Tom assists her. The baby is fine, but Agnes is not, and she dies. In the book, this scene actually comes in at page 60, but it's a good key scene to start with. Prior to this, it's mostly just Tom struggling to find work. We immediately skip to page 125 in the book, with the monk Philip arriving in Kingsbridge to visit the cathedral. In the book, we briefly get to see him at his small cell situated in the forest and aptly named St. John in the Forest, where he is prior, but we never see St. John's in the game. Philip arrives to find the monks of Kingsbridge holding a funeral service for their prior James. The monks report that they found footprints leading to the river and a hole in the ice, indicating that for some reason James had walked out onto it, fallen through and been swept away, his body never found. However, in the book, while Philip does arrive to find prior James has died, he does so by finding James's body lying in a coffin. Philip, persuaded by his allies Cuthbert and Milius, puts himself forward as a candidate to be the new prior, going up against the current sub-prior Remigius. Philip's brother Francis, a priest who works for the Earl of Gloucester, is waiting for Philip at the cathedral. He tells Philip of a plot hatched by certain nobles, including his own Earl, with the intent of overthrowing the current king, Stephen. Francis believes that if Stephen is deposed, it will be bad for the church in England, but cannot betray the plot himself as he will be hanged by his Earl, so has come to Philip to betray it instead and take the news to the Bishop of Kingsbridge, Wailer and Bygod. This is largely true to the book, only that Philip makes this request at St. John in the Forest, not Kingsbridge Cathedral, and though he does ask Philip to take the news to the bishop is not yet Wailerin. Chapter 2 introduces us to the young Jack and his mother Ellen. Living in the woods, Jack and Ellen watch from the bushes as Francis finds the very baby Agnes gave birth to and Tom has left behind, as he doesn't believe he can feed it. Jack then runs into Tom and his family, who have decided to return for the baby, and he helps to track where Francis has taken it, eventually running into Ellen, who confirms where the baby has been taken and offers the family shelter. Ellen and Tom ultimately agree to travel together and help each other out. In the book, Francis does find the baby, but before he has come to see Philip at St. John's, not after, choosing to leave it with him and his monks. As for how the two families meet, they actually first bump into each other in the events before the game starts while Tom is looking for work and Agnes is still alive. They part ways after, with Tom noting that Jack is strange and Ellen is attractive. Their second meeting is actually one of the few scenes in the book that I thought a bit weird. Tom and his children are on the brink of exhaustion, desperately searching for the baby. His children have passed out, and Tom has slumped down a little ways from them in a semi-delusional state when he sees what he thinks is an angel walking towards him. It turns out to be Ellen who, without a word, strips and starts having sex with the man whose wife died less than 24 hours ago. Once they've finished, Ellen reveals she knows where the baby is. Once she has shown him, they agree it would be best to leave it with the monks, and Tom moves on very quickly and decides to ask Ellen to be his wife. The book does remark upon his feelings of guilt, but, even so. In Chapter 3, Philip arrives at Bishop Waleran's palace and tells him of the plot. Waleran seems like an alright guy, which is similar to Philip's first impression of him in the book. Aside from the fact that Waleran is an archdeacon at this point in the book, and that Philip goes to him before he goes to Kingsbridge, this is pretty much the same. Meanwhile, at the Earl of Shiring's castle, Tom has arrived looking for work. Jack helps him find things that need fixing, and Tom is ultimately hired after pointing out that the Earl's defences are in need of repairs. This is how it happens in the book, though Jack doesn't help and Tom only mentions the defences as a last desperate attempt to get hired. Jack and Martha meet the Earl's daughter Aliena, though they don't go up to her room in the book. Philip returns to Kingsbridge, where Francis has returned with Tom's baby. Soon after, soldiers invade the priory, but it turns out to be nothing more than Waleran's retinue. He has come to endorse Philip as prior and has clearly got Remigius to concede. While Waleran does come to Kingsbridge to endorse Philip as prior in the book, the circumstances are a little different. Firstly, Waleran comes at Philip's behest, and secondly, he, still an archdeacon remember, agrees to support Philip only if Philip in return supports him to succeed the bishop when he dies. It is only after Philip has agreed to this that he discovers Waleran has not disclosed that the bishop has already died, and thus Philip has to immediately return the favour. It's not actually very clear in the game why Waleran wants Philip to become prior, especially as he already seems to have Remigius wrapped around his finger. At the end of the chapter we glimpse William Hamley, the son of Percy Hamley, a minor lord and ally of Waleran, leading an attack on the Earl's castle. William is a POV character in the book, but as the main antagonist you don't control him in the game. In the book, the attack happens, but the game has it simplified. The plan for William to lead an army of charging horsemen is specifically shot down, as the castle could too easily employ its defences and prevent the army from getting in. William actually leads a small band of men in on a stealth mission and disables the gates, allowing his father to lead the attack and gain entry unimpeded. With the Earl under arrest, Tom is once again unemployed, so travels to Kingsbridge hoping for work. However, Philip cannot afford it and can only offer him a meal and a place to sleep. There is a specific change here that is so small I wouldn't usually mention it, but on this occasion I have reason to. Tom, disheartened at once again not finding work, says,
"I'll accept, but I'd rather earn it."
Which is a line from the book. The response he receives is also from the book.
Ask God then. That wouldn't be begging, it'd be prayer.
What's interesting about this is that in the game, the hard-nosed and stern sub-prior Remigius is the one who responds, but in the book, it's actually Philip who says this. Why the change? I believe it's because the line comes across as quite cold, and thus the developers decided to have the bad Remigius say it rather than the good Philip. This elimination of nuance in the characters' personalities will be seen again. Jack, really not keen to go back to starving on the road, surmises that if the cathedral was badly damaged, Philip would be forced to hire Tom to build a new one, and thus takes the initiative and sets fire to it. The only noticeable difference from the book is that as Jack is about to escape, he sees a dishevelled, crazy-looking monk through the flames. You can probably take a guess as to who this is, but all I'm going to say for now is that this does not happen in the book. At the start of Chapter 6, we are in Winchester and see Aliena and her younger brother Richard sneaking past the Hamleys. Unless you're looking for it, you probably won't spot the scar on Richard's face that wasn't there the last time you saw him in Earl's Castle. That will come up later. Philip arrives to join Waleran in petitioning the king for the church to receive the earldom's lands, ostensibly so that Philip can use its resources for the building of a new cathedral. Waleran has enlisted the help of King Stephen's brother, Bishop Henry, and the two of them are waiting with the Hamleys, though the two parties, as is made evidence once they receive an audience with the king, each want to be rewarded with the earldom, which is why in the books they do not approach him together. The king says he needs time to make his decision. Afterwards, William Hamley's mother, Regan, approaches Philip and tells him he is being used by Waleran and that she has proof. William takes Philip to Waleran's palace and shows him the castle Waleran is building, proof that Waleran has no intention of building a cathedral. Angered, Philip returns to negotiate with the Hamleys, and they agree to ask the king to split the earldom between them. All of this is how it goes down in the book, though with some additions, such as Bishop Henry asking Philip to get a confession from the former Earl of Shiring, who he never meets in the book, and a section where William barges into Waleran's palace and Philip has to get him to leave. There is another bit where, during the journey to Waleran's castle, William rides out of earshot of Philip to talk with a man he calls a horse thief. This will be relevant later. Gonna skip chapter 7, because not much happens there. At the beginning of book 2, we get to play Aliena for the first time. She is being held hostage by William in her room at what was her father's castle before he was arrested and taken away. Her younger brother, Richard, is chained up outside, and her steward, Matthew, is tentatively serving William so he can look out for the former Earl's kids. After being forced to get William some food, he and Aliena argue when suddenly Richard, somehow having broken free, rushes into the castle to take his vengeance against William. In the ensuing ruckus, Aliena is flung against the wall and Richard gets his earlobe sliced off, while Walter calmly sidles up behind Matthew and, for no particular reason, stabs him in the back. This is the point that confirmed what I was beginning to suspect, that some of the grimmer parts of the book, particularly concerning sexual violence, are toned down for the game. In the book, Aliena, Richard and Matthew are not captives, but are hiding out in the castle. Walter and William do break in, do kill Matthew, and do cut Richard's earlobe off. Noticeably missing, however, is the part where Walter and William each have a turn raping Aliena. Darker still, they don't just cut off Richard's earlobe for fun. William can't pry open Aliena's legs, so he threatens Richard. When Aliena still can't bring herself to do it, that's when they chop his earlobe off, and then when she relents, they force him to watch. The game still isn't for kids, but it has certainly been modified for a wider age range, and as such, I don't think you can ever really hate Game William in the way you hate Book William. On a quick side note, I do think it's interesting that across all story mediums, sexual violence is considered so much more taboo than death, blood, and dismemberment. Back to the game's version of events. In the aftermath of this hubbub, Walter actually warns William off touching Aliena, a far cry from holding Richard down and, quote, watching greedily. Richard and Aliena end up both chained up outside, but manage to escape with a horse. They are never chained up in the book, but they do escape with William and Walter's horses. They decide to ride to Winchester to find their father. Along the way, a woman stops you and introduces herself as the local verderer's wife. She offers to give medical attention to Richard's ear, and you are given the choice of whether to trust her or not. If you have read the book before playing the game, you would probably choose not to, as in it, the verderer himself invites the pair back to his hut before locking them in his shed and stealing their horses. They only escape because the verderer's wife lets them go. In the game, even if you choose not to trust them, the verderer comes after you and steals the horse anyway. I'm saying this a lot, but once again, we will be returning to this incident later. Chapter 9 begins with Aliena and Richard arriving in Winchester to search for their father who is in jail. The jailer, Odo, demands a bribe before he will let them in to see him. They go to the market and meet Meg, a wool merchant, and she gives them some money for helping count her sacks of wool. They then go and see their father, who is clearly dying and who makes them swear a vow that Richard will take back the earldom. He tells them that he left some money with a priest that they should collect and then head on to Huntly, where they will find and live with their aunt and uncle on their mother's side. Their mother died some time ago, by the way, that's why she's not around. The kids track down the priest and confront him in an alley, but he claims to know nothing of the money. Aliena threatens him and gets him to give it up, but he has already spent most of it. Disheartened, they head off to Huntly. The Winchester arc is mostly true to the book, just simplified. Aliena and Richard spend quite a bit of time trying to find work in the book so that they can pay Odo, but all they do is get rejected until Meg agrees to pay Odo for them. And they confront the priest in his house, not in an alley. Richard and Aliena leave Winchester for Huntly, only to find that their aunt and uncle's house is in ruins after some people took them away. In the book, they do find their uncle, but their aunt, their mother's sister, is dead, and the uncle refuses to take them in. Aliena takes a walk and ends up talking to a peasant who is shearing his sheep. She has the bright idea of paying him for his wool, less than he would receive at the market, but saving him travel, and taking the wool herself to sell at a profit, then endeavouring to do the same with the surrounding sheep farmers. She returns to Richard to tell him of her plan when suddenly they are interrupted by a man who attacks Richard, and Aliena is forced to stab him to death. This attack never happens in the book, which is why I was so surprised to find out that Richard had actually died as a result of the beating and his infected ear wound. After a little research, I found out why. The man that attacks Richard is the verderer, and also the same man that William calls horse thief when riding with Philip. William pays him to track the two of them down. Whether Richard survives comes down to a single choice, made in the chapter before, whether or not you trust the verderer's wife. If you do, you still end up with your horse stolen, but the woman does treat Richard's ear. I'm not sure if this is slightly sloppy design or a purposeful trick designed to give book readers a different experience. If Richard dies, he will be replaced by Sir Catface, a knight loyal to their father, and so, if like me you used your knowledge of the book to influence your decision, then you'll get Richard killed. There's nothing inherently wrong with this, but as I was trying to keep the game as close to the book as possible to study the non-optional changes, I had to go back and redo Chapter 8 and 9. Anyway, resuming with Richard alive, Chapter 9 ends with the two of them returning to Winchester with wool to sell. They negotiate a good price with the merchant and happen to run into Philip, who invites them to Kingsbridge. While the game has you negotiate a deal yourself, in the book, the wool merchant stubbornly refuses to pay Aliena his normal rate because she is a woman. Philip, feeling guilty for having wrecked Aliena's life by reporting her father to Waleran, buys her wool, then sells it on to the merchant, forcing him to pay the normal rate now that he's no longer buying off a woman. Then Philip offers to buy her wool any time, effectively saving the two of them from poverty. Chapter 10 begins with a 5-year time jump. Construction on the cathedral is progressing. Alfred is a master craftsman, Jack is Tom's apprentice, and Aliena is a merchant in her own right. Jack sneaks off to meet with Aliena, who, it becomes apparent, he is in a secret relationship with. This skips over rather a lot of Jack and Aliena's development. By this point in the book, they're not in a relationship, and in fact have only really just started talking to each other. A few other noticeable differences discerned from conversations are that Alfred, Martha, Jack and Aliena all know that baby Jonathan's dad is Tom, but in the book, this is only known by Tom and Ellen. Aliena also knows that Jack set fire to the old cathedral, something he only ever tells Tom in a fit of rage later on. And Cuthbert has died, but he is still very much alive in the book. While in the cathedral, Tom and Jack are arguing when suddenly a pile of bricks is dropped and nearly kills Tom. Jack quickly realises there was a strange monk in black wandering around earlier. He looks for him, finds him, and gives chase. Just as he is about to find out who it is, Ellen appears and seizes hold of him. She remarks that she knows who the monk is and insists that he return to the people who sent him and report that he was successful in assassinating Tom Builder. She then refuses to tell Jack who it was or what is going on. Why? Not sure. Why did she let him go? Don't know. How does she know he'll do as she asked? No idea. Does this come off as a bit weak? Yup. Does any of it happen in the book? No. Having heard that the Earl of Shiring, now Percy Hamley, or is it, has reneged on the deal to allow Kingsbridge to use its quarry, Philip has travelled down to Shiring to ask why, and Aliena has accompanied him so that she can give some money to her brother who she is now funding as a knight in King Stephen's army in the hope that Stephen will grow to like Richard enough that he will grant him the earldom back. Nothing much of note happens in Chapter 11, the specifics of which are mostly a fabrication. For example, Aliena is now funding Richard to fight in Stephen's army, but there's never an actual scene where she goes down to Shiring to give him some money. At the end of the chapter, the two of them are granted an audience, only to discover that William's parents have been poisoned and so William is the Earl now. He is preventing the use of the quarry as Kingsbridge is holding an illegal market which is diverting business from Shiring. In the book, neither of William's parents have been poisoned, though Percy, William's father, has died of a stroke, so William has taken over. However, this is known to Kingsbridge, as is William's attack on the quarry, so Philip, rather than travel to Shiring, chooses instead to visit the king again and request a market license, so that he's legally covered. In Chapter 12, it is revealed that the black monk assassin that tried to kill Tom is none other than Waleran's servant, Timothy, and it is further revealed that it is also he who poisoned William's parents, but his mother has survived. Philip travels on to Lincoln, where the king is currently leading his army. How the king treats you here is subject to choices you've made, but either way, during your conversation, Robert of Gloucester, the earl that Francis works for, attacks. In the ensuing battle, Stephen loses, and Philip, who has been watching from the top of Lincoln Cathedral, has a bit of a breakdown witnessing all this violence and ultimately loses his faith in God. He is captured by Robert's men, but Francis finds him, releases him, and brings him before Empress Maud, Stephen's rival, who grants him a market license. Philip's reaction is not quite so extreme in the book. With Stephen taking William's side in their dispute, Philip is actually elated as he watches Stephen lose, knowing he can now take his request to Empress Maud. However, he is disturbed by the subsequent raping, looting, and killing that Robert's men visit upon the citizens of Lincoln, and is disheartened by his inability to get them to stop, eventually pulling a rapist off a woman by his hair and immediately getting knocked out and captured. Despite this, there is no indication that Philip's faith is in any way shaken, and the notion is pretty much an impossibility for Book Philip. Meanwhile, Jack and Aliena bang on top of the unfinished cathedral while Alfred peeps on them. Obviously, because this is a terrible way to keep a clandestine relationship a secret, this never happens in the book. Kingsbridge, market day. Everything has turned out all right. Philip has decided an intelligent chap like Jack would be a great service to the church and is hoping to convince him to become a monk, while Alfred, completely out of the blue, proposes to Aliena. Before we can get an answer to these questions, things turn very ugly as William Hamley leads an attack on Kingsbridge. The market is burned, the remains of the cathedral's St. Adolphus are stolen, and 11 people are killed, one of them Milius. William rides into the cathedral and comes face to face with Tom Bilder. If Ellen caught Timothy, the Black Monk assassin, then William will mention that he heard the cathedral's Master Builder had died. If Ellen didn't catch Timothy, or if Tom tells William he is still alive, William will have his horse kick Tom in the head, killing him, but if Tom pretends to confirm his death, he will still be kicked in the head, but survive. In the aftermath of the attack, Jack accepts Philip's offer to become a monk, though it's not very clear why, especially given his relationship with Aliena. In the book, Alfred does propose to Aliena sometime before the attack, but is turned down. Jack has also become a monk after the attack, having greater reason to than his gay counterpart due to a fight with Alfred that results in Jack's expulsion from working on the cathedral. As a monk, he is able to help design it. Furthermore, Aliena and Jack are still not in a relationship at this point. Though they are falling in love, Aliena is concerned that she not be distracted from the vow made to her father, as well as still being traumatized by the memory of her rape, has put the whole thing on ice. William does lead an attack on the market, torching the town and Aliena's wool supply, destroying the business that she worked so hard to build. However, he does not steal St. Adolphus, and rather than 11, 193 people are killed. Though like Cuthbert before him, Milius does not die. The two of them actually help to order food from the surrounding farms in the aftermath. Tom, on the other hand, is killed after being kicked in the head by William's horse during a stampede. As Timothy trying to assassinate Tom never happens in the book, there is no cause for William to even suspect that Tom is already dead. But had there been, Tom wouldn't have been able to lie about who he is, as Tom and William have met before. The last chapter of Book 2 has Aliena informing Jack that she is going to marry Alfred, as he can provide the financial support needed to fund Richard. Jack gets mad and attacks Alfred. He is locked up, escapes, and is told by his mother what happened to his father, a jongleur who was arrested on the accusation that he had stolen a jewelled cup from Kingsbridge and then melted it down and sold it. For this, he was hanged. Jack decides to leave Kingsbridge and travel Europe, perhaps finding his father's family along the way. Meanwhile, Aliena is living a boring life with Alfred as a housewife. The relationship is a civil but awkward one, and the two have not consummated their marriage. And then Aliena discovers she's pregnant with what can only be Jack's baby. Soon enough, everything comes crashing down. Literally. Alfred adds a stone roof to the design and tries to build it too quickly with terrible results. Work stops on the cathedral. Alfred discovers Aliena is with a child that can't be his and leaves her. She decides that the only thing left to do is board a ship and try to find Jack. Meanwhile, Waleran draws up plans to build a cathedral in Shiring, with William funding it so God will heal his mother, and with none other than Remigius as prior and Alfred as master builder. Okay, so, in the book, Jack's bit is mostly right. Aliena does tell him she's going to marry Alfred, which he is devastated by. Later he tries to go and see her but commits a monastic offence and is locked up. His mother rescues him and tells him the story of his father, though the cup is planted on him and retrieved after his arrest, not supposedly melted down. Jack pays a visit to Aliena, which ultimately results in them having sex for the first time, but afterwards Aliena continues with her plan to marry Alfred. Desperate to stop this, Jack goes to Alfred and reveals that Aliena doesn't love him. Alfred, for reasons we'll get into in a second, doesn't care. Furious, Jack decides the only thing left to do is leave. Now, as for Alfred and Aliena's marriage, I'm going to have to take a moment to talk about Alfred. Thus far, I have avoided mentioning Alfred much, as he is so very different from the Alfred in the book that I would have essentially been repeating, Alfred is not like this in the book, almost every single time he pops up. But now seems like a good time to cover him. In the game, Alfred has thus far shown himself to be perhaps a little rude and petty, but that seems to be the extent of his bad side. You can actually, earlier on in the game while playing as Jack, give Alfred some food which causes the game to label the two of them friends. When I saw this, I was very curious to see how things would play out between them, as they are far from friends in the book. However, despite the occasional and random expression of affection, there is never actually any show of real friendship between the two. But despite this, trading insults is about as bad as it gets between them.
You useless little turd.
Book Alfred is, after William Hamley and his goons, the most despicable character in the novel. When young, he bullies Martha and Jack mercilessly. Jack's expulsion from working on the cathedral, and subsequently having to become a monk, comes about after the pair cause significant damage while fighting on the building site, after Alfred goads Jack with the reveal that his father was hanged as a thief. When Jack visits Alfred to ask him to call off their wedding, revealing that Aliena is in love with him instead, Alfred breaks out into a grin, and Jack realises that Alfred already knows this and is choosing to marry Aliena to take her away from Jack. And as for the marriage itself, it is far from the awkward but civil affair we see in the game. On the wedding night, Alfred can't get it up, and naturally blames her and punishes her by having her sleep at the foot of his bed, on the floor, like a dog, every night. As for the cathedral, Alfred does try to put up a stone roof and, admittedly at Philip's behest, tries to build it too quickly. The top of the cathedral does come crumbling down, but worse, in the middle of a service, killing 79 people. Aliena gives birth to a son that is obviously Jack's, which she freely admits to. Alfred throws her out, leaves Kingsbridge, and construction on the cathedral comes to a halt. Aliena does decide to go search for Jack in Europe, while Alfred and Remigius's defection is sort of true, but doesn't happen until later, so I shall leave that for now. Book 3 begins with Aliena arriving in France to look for Jack. She travels around for a bit and meets a blind elderly woman who is making her way to Santiago de Compostela after running away long ago. They travel together for a time, but alas, the elderly woman dies a little before they get there. Aliena pushes on and finds out that Jack has been to Toledo. Meanwhile, Jack is in Toledo with a friend he has made called Rashid. He shows off how 3 inventions work to Rashid and his friends. Rashid's daughter, Aisha, later joins them, and there's a little flirting between them. Jack can explain how each of the inventions work apart from the last, the Weeping Lady. Aliena comes to Toledo sometime later, talks to Aisha, and finds out that Jack has been there, but despite the offer of Aisha's hand, decided to move on and head back to Paris, where they are working on a new cathedral. Aliena rushes back after him, and finally the two meet again. They get married and live there for a year, but decide they want to return home to Kingsbridge. They reach Cherbourg, where a ship will take them back to England, but are confronted with a riot threatening to break out over a trickster pretending to do miracles. Jack, who was gifted the Weeping Lady by Rashid, raises it above his head declaring it the Holy Mother, and uses it to calm the crowd who start throwing money at him in return for the Holy Mother's blessing. Then there's a very quick kind of rush bit at the end where an elderly woman cries out that Jack is a ghost because he looks exactly like her son, and that's how Jack finds out his dad's name was not Jack Cherbourg, but actually Jacques Cherbourg. Jack found his family at last. In the book, Aliena's initial travels around Europe tracking Jack are basically right with a few optional additional steps, though she never meets an old lady who dies on the way. Jack is living in Toledo and spending time with his friend Rashid. Their one scene in the game is made up but doesn't do a bad job of demonstrating their relationship. Aisha and Jack do become very close to the point where Jack starts to consider settling down with her, but he ultimately decides not to and leaves. When Aliena comes a knocking, it is Aisha's mother whom she speaks to. Aliena correctly surmises that Jack has been there, but the mother, annoyed at him for rejecting her daughter, refuses to tell her where he is gone. Aliena is about to give up on the whole search when Aisha, tears running down her cheeks, explains he has gone to Paris. She follows him there and the two begin living as man and wife, though it should be noted that they are not married. The riot does not happen in Cherbourg, but while they are still in Paris, when the King of France comes to visit the cathedral Jack has been working on. During the visit, the crowd that is gathered to witness the procession turns ugly, which is when Jack uses the Weeping Lady. The crowd starts throwing money, and Jack gets the idea to tour their way back to Kingsbridge, raising money as they go. When he reaches Cherbourg, it's more fleshed out, but Jack is called out as a ghost and ultimately finds out who his dad was and meets his family. Aliena and Jack return to Kingsbridge, having dressed their entourage up and created a fantastical story about the Weeping Lady's origin. Philip sees through their illusion and is unwilling to participate in it until a woman who was struck dumb inexplicably speaks, leaving Philip to believe it is a true miracle. Remigius, however, still considers it a fake miracle, and, outraged at Philip allowing it to be harboured in the cathedral, he resigns. This is simplified, but generally accurate to the book, aside from Remigius resigning, though Remigius does leave later to become prior of the church in Shiring. Ellen then reveals to Jack that the three men who framed Jack's father were Percy Hamley, Prior James, and Waleran Bygod, but she doesn't know why they did it. In Shiring, Waleran's cathedral is underway, with Alfred as master builder and Remigius as prior. There is a slightly corny scene where the good four, consisting of Richard, Aliena, Jack and Philip, face off with the bad four, Waleran, Alfred, William and Remigius, and declare that Kingsbridge is now under their protection. In the book, Waleran plans to build a church in Shiring that will one day be a cathedral, but not build a cathedral straight away. And by this point in the story, he still hasn't actually started it, with Alfred still building houses, and Remigius still at Kingsbridge. So there's some time manipulation going on here in an effort to condense the story. There is no Avengers-style face-off, but during their joint speech, Richard says,
"From now on, Kingsbridge is protected.
By our knights! By our walls!"
Kingsbridge never has any knights. Richard himself, by this point having lost his funding when Alfred left Aliena, is mostly spending his days in the alehouse, though he does go on to become head of the watch, responsible for Kingsbridge's security. However, the walls line is a reference to a part of the story which never features in the game, in which Richard gets wind of William planning to lead another attack on Kingsbridge, and the whole town comes together to build a makeshift wall overnight, which ultimately repels the assault. Another storyline that gets cut out at this point is Aliena and Jack's illegitimate marriage. In the game, they simply get married. In the book, Aliena is still technically married to Alfred, even though it was never consummated. The monks are unwilling to allow Jack to be master builder of their cathedral while he is living in sin with another man's wife. Philip is initially confident that an application to the Archbishop of Canterbury will result in an annulment, but Waleran, as a favour to William, exerts his influence to have it continually denied. So, for the next few years, Aliena and Jack are forced to live apart, and though they do sneak off to shag pretty often, the relationship undergoes an increasingly heavy strain as time passes. We'll get to how this is resolved a bit later. Chapter 17 begins with an 11-year time skip, bringing us to the year 1154. In the introduction, we are told,
It had been 3 years. 3 years of drought. 3 years of hunger and poverty. England was brought to its knees. Only our walls had kept us safe from the bands of outlaws raiding towns and villages. Bishop Waleran and William Hamley forced the workers to finish their cathedral in Shiring. Many had died.
I think all adaptations run into this problem at some point. Unable to incorporate every aspect of what is usually a complex and well thought out story, the adaptation eventually finds itself filling in the gaps with tenuous detail. The idea that Waleran and William could have forced their workers who were able to leave whenever they wished, to death during a famine to build an entire cathedral in about half the time it took Kingsbridge to build theirs, let's just say it's a stretch. Anyway, Jack can't figure out why the top of the cathedral keeps cracking. He decides the problem must come from below, down in the crypt. When investigating, he finds a hideout which belonged to Prior James. Within is the goblet that Jack's dad was accused of stealing, and a whip Prior James was using to self-flagellate. Jack remarks that this proves his father's innocence and that Prior James must have been who he saw the night he was in the burning cathedral. Philip asks him why he was in the cathedral on that night, to which Jack can confess to setting it on fire or not. Either way, Philip will determine Jack did do it, but soon after forgives it as the action of a desperate child. In the book, while a crack does keep returning at the top of the cathedral, the cause is far less exciting. Jack works out that the higher up you go, the stronger the wind is, which gives him the revolutionary idea to have elegant buttresses that don't need hiding from view, as they are not unsightly, propping higher up parts of the wall. That's it. That's all there is to it. You might recall that I said at the beginning that, in the book, Philip discovers James's body in a coffin, so there's no fake death and no secret hideout. Jack also never dares tell Philip that he set fire to the original cathedral, though to be fair, it's not impossible for me to imagine Book Philip reacting the same way. Meanwhile, Aliena is out and about and has to take shelter from a terrible storm at a peasant's hut. She comes to the rescue of a young girl called Elizabeth who, it turns out, is married to William Hamley. While Elizabeth is jeered by the peasants, Aliena gives her some advice on how to make the best of her position, before Walter returns to retrieve her. There are some minor differences in the book. The storm is worse, levelling the houses of the entire village. They take shelter in a church with a grumpy priest rather than a hut with an old woman, and it's not Walter but one of William's other henchmen serving as Elizabeth's escort. Back in Kingsbridge, Philip and Jack find a few outlaws raiding them at night. As a result, all the main characters still in Kingsbridge have a big meeting. They determine that the growing number of outlaws is because of William, and something must be done about him at last. They ultimately come up with two choices. One, to rally the outlaws and have them fight against William under Richard's leadership, or two, meet secretly with Regan Hamley, who is still physically weak after being poisoned. If you choose Regan, you move immediately on to the next chapter, whereas if you choose to rally the outlaws, Aliena and Richard seek out their leader, the Butcher. This turns out to be the same old lady Aliena sheltered with during the storm, and depending on the options picked, she will either agree or not to help you. In the book, rather than a couple of outlaws snaffling some food during the night, it's actually a large mob that try to attack Kingsbridge in much the same way William did, but they are easily repelled. In the wake of this, Aliena does have the bright idea of persuading them to band together and fight under Richard. However, there is no old lady butcher they have to convince. Richard uses the outlaws to raid William's lands rather than assault his castle, and then takes them to fight for Empress Maud's son, Henry, against King Stephen. They never consider the option to go to Regan because Regan has died by this point. These last 3 chapters are going to be a little more difficult to compare, as nearly everything from here on in-game is made up. Aliena sneaks into the castle, meets up with Elizabeth, who defends Regan and Walter as good people. Walter takes you to Regan, but no matter what is said, this always ends with Elizabeth or Aliena stabbing William to death. Richard and Aliena claim the earldom. In the book, King Stephen and Henry draw up a peace treaty which declares that all titles will revert back to their original owners upon Stephen's death. Getting wind of this early and unwilling to wait that long, Aliena and Richard race back to Shiring and draw up a plan to take William's castle before he returns. Knowing a straight assault won't work, Aliena sneaks in, meets up with Elizabeth, and then has her make a speech which distracts those left on guard just long enough for Richard and his men to make it inside and take the castle. Even if Regan had been alive, Aliena would never have gone to her or Walter, as neither of them are in any way good people. When William returns and finds his castle taken, he realises that King Stephen is unlikely to bother helping him get it back, and returns to the small village his family ruled before they were granted the earldom. However, he is not yet done, and later will be appointed Sheriff of Shiring. Back in game, Philip has been arrested and put on trial for heresy because of some books he's been writing questioning certain practices of the church. Bishop Henry, Waleran and Aliena preside over this trial, but it is temporarily suspended when Jack produces the chalice that Waleran had claimed his father had stolen and subsequently accuses Waleran of lying. Bishop Henry demands a witness to back up these charges. Jack, Aliena and Jonathan have a think and decide Remigius can probably testify to this effect, so Jonathan goes off to track him down. While Jonathan is tracking him down, he can come across Alfred, who seems to have settled down in Shiring. So let's take a quick diversion to talk about what happens to him in the book. When we left off, Alfred had thrown Aliena out of his house, then left to go build houses in Shiring. He does this for a while and prospers until the famine hits and work dries up. Starving, he returns to Kingsbridge and begs Jack for a job who, out of deference towards his deceased father, hires him. Unsurprisingly, this turns out to be a mistake when Alfred persuades the other builders to leave and come build the church in Shiring for Waleran with him as master builder. This falls through after Richard takes back the earldom and Alfred is once again starving. Aliena walks into her house one day to find none other than Alfred, who begs her for money. Aliena essentially tells him that she's not his biggest fan, when suddenly Alfred pounces on her and starts trying to rape her. Luckily, Richard arrives and after a short scuffle, kills Alfred. So ends the story of the second biggest shit in the book. Back to the game, Jonathan tracks Remigius down and finds Timothy attempting to DIY hang him, clearly on Waleran's orders. After this, Remigius is unsurprisingly willing to testify and does so. Waleran is arrested. However, Bishop Henry orders that Philip is still guilty and must undergo an ordeal by fire. Nothing quite so dramatic happens in the book. Philip is put on trial not for heresy, but is instead accused of fathering Jonathan. However, Ellen arrives and refutes this, revealing to everyone for the first time that Tom is Jonathan's father. She then goes on to accuse Waleran of perjury, and Remigius, who, like Alfred, by this point had fallen on hard times after the construction of Shiring Church had stopped but was forgiven and welcomed back to Kingsbridge by Philip, backs this up. Waleran promptly flees. The final chapter starts with Philip, now looking quite old and not burned to death, returning to Kingsbridge. Jonathan, now prior of Kingsbridge, as Philip is retired back to St. John in the Forest, lets him know he has a visitor. Waleran is waiting to ask if Philip really was saved by God on the night of the burning. Flashing back, things do look bad for Philip as the flames come closer, but then they are miraculously extinguished. Is it really God? Well, in another fantastically improbable scene, we see that the pyre has been built in such a way that observers cannot see that Philip is surrounded by water. Thus it appears he has been saved by a miracle. Whether or not Philip enlightens Waleran to this fact, Waleran leaves to wander a humble man, and Philip gives a pleasant epilogue in which Jack and Aliena are happy, and their son Tommy is now Master Builder. Thus ends the game. Now I'm not going to go into ponderous detail on everything that's left out at this point, because there is quite a lot, but I'll bullet point some of the major stuff. Philip obviously never has to undergo an ordeal by fire, so there is no insane pyre illusion. William, now sheriff, attempts to arrest Richard for murdering Alfred, but Richard flees to join the Crusades in the Holy Land as penance. He never returns, settling down over there and eventually dying with no children. Aliena runs the earldom while he is gone and does a much better job. Waleran, reflecting real history, convinces William to take some knights to kill Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, with whom the now King Henry is feuding. This backfires when Henry is outraged at what they've done, and William finally does meet his end, pissing himself as he is hanged. Jonathan does become Prior of Kingsbridge, though Philip, rather than retiring, is actually promoted to Bishop of Kingsbridge. Waleran, supposedly having done all he had under the belief that God wanted him to, comes to Kingsbridge to live out his remaining days as a humble monk. He confesses to Jack his part in getting Jack's father killed. With Richard dead and with no heirs, the earldom passes to the next male in line, and so Tommy does not become Master Builder of Kingsbridge, but Earl of Shiring. And that's that. I definitely think, probably surprising no one, that the book is the better story of the two, and as the game is so story focused, I'd recommend the book first. Still, I enjoyed my time with the game also, the visuals being a definite highlight, and it was interesting to see what changes they chose to make. Which I guess is why I made a long-ass time-consuming video on it. No doubt it has extremely niche appeal, but if you have stuck it out, I hope you've enjoyed it, and found it interesting as well.